If I can have your attention, welcome everyone. I'm glad everyone is starting to eat. Please feel free to continue that. Welcome to our noontime conversation today. My name is Maria de Jesus. I'm Associate Director for Teaching and Learning at CTRL. We have some of our colleagues here as well at CTRL who make this happen, both in thought process and the actual logistics of all of this. So today's conversation is navigating diverse political ideologies in the classroom and beyond. How do we hold productive discussions, both inside the classroom and out, when we have a context, which some would argue may be increasingly a context of diverse political ideologies, both from faculty, of students within the classroom? How do we create spaces in which we can open up and enrich conversations? So we're going to have opening remarks, and these will be brief from each of our panelists. Wendy Melillo is from School of Communication, Eric Lohr from History and College of Arts and Sciences, Lynn Addington from SPA, School of Public Affairs, and last but not least, Rose Shinko from SIS, School of International Service. And it's really meant to open up a larger conversation here. And so we're going to be passing around the mic. If you have insights, thoughts, questions, we invite those post the panel. Okay, so without further ado, we're going to start with Wendy.
Okay, good morning. Welcome, everyone. I'm from the School of Communication, and I'd like to title my remarks, "We Can Disagree Without Being Disagreeable." And so I approach this topic in the classroom by setting some ground rules for discussion. When there's disagreement about a political topic or any topic, we need to follow the ground rules for debate. Students have to present their points of view. They have to back it up with facts. All points of view are welcomed, and students are encouraged to have fun with the debate. Since I teach strategic communication, political communication is an important part of class content. So I approach this by emphasizing good and bad examples of political messaging on both sides of the aisle. And I do this by establishing a historical foundation that takes us back, and we point out good examples historically, bad examples historically, and there's balance in the approach to the material that we're studying. In this way, students get to examine and discuss all approaches so that they can form their own conclusions about which party is doing a better job at messaging. Where I think professors run into trouble in this area in the classroom is when we start to cross a line and start telling students what to think about politics or which party is better for the country. People don't like to be told what to think. And so this is really important because we're operating in beyond a hyper-partisan environment that students are watching us very, very carefully, okay? I have talked to students outside the classroom about the issue, and there is a perception that has formed about certain schools at AU. And this is a sensitive topic, but students think that some schools are fairer than others on our campus about discussing politics. I'm not going to name schools, all right? But I think we should be aware of this. Worse, which schools have professors who demonize one or the other political party in an attempt to sway young minds? This is of real concern on our campus. So we have to address that and think about that in the classroom. The problem comes for us when we try to instill some sense of ethics and fairness. We could all agree that lying or manufacturing fake content to manipulate people's minds is bad. But what happens when you try to talk about what is going on in our current presidential administration? You may be right as a professor to point out that it's bad for a president to consistently lie to the American people or attack our institutions, but there could be a strongly Republican student seated in the classroom who immediately starts thinking you are a real left-wing liberal, trying to demonize the Republican president and his political party. So I think we have to think about the concept of media literacy and start from that viewpoint. Before forming any conclusions about the messages in front of you, understand how strategic communication works in a society. All right, understand how persuasion works. What is propaganda? How do you recognize it? In my opinion, media literacy should be taught through K through 12 in public schools before they even get to us, but that is not happening. So it becomes our responsibility. We have to deal with this. Here's how insidious fake messaging has become. Did anybody see this headline in the New York Times yesterday? The headline is, "It was only a matter of time. Here comes an app for fake videos." At first, when I read the headline, I got excited. I thought we were going to have a new technology that would help us detect fake videos. Silly me. You know what this thing is? The article opens with a description of a video where someone who looks exactly like Michelle Obama is doing a striptease. The fake app allowed the video's creator to put a picture of Michelle Obama, to put a picture of her head on the body of a pornographic film actress. If you did not have any sense of being media literate, you would actually think that this was the former First Lady. The existence of the technology raises all sorts of ethical issues that we are just beginning to wrestle with. Now we have to educate students about something called deep fakes, because that's what this is. To quote the New York Times, "It's not hard to imagine this technology being used to smear politicians, create counterfeit revenge porn, or frame people for crimes. Lawmakers have already begun to worry about how deep fakes could be used for political sabotage and propaganda." This just makes media literacy that much more critical in any classroom discussion. Let me make some brief remarks now about whether a professor should reveal his or her own political viewpoints in the classroom. There's real debate on this topic on campus. It's very controversial. I bring my authentic self into the classroom. I can't teach any other way. This is who I am. If I'm asked directly, if it's relevant to the conversation, I will reveal my political affiliation. But I don't make a point of starting every political conversation that way. And when I do discuss my political affiliation, I mention that I'm married to a member of the opposite party. Students find this intriguing, and it opens up a discussion about how to find balance. This, in turn, prompts a discussion about what's missing in our current political debate. I am fond of using the example of Antonin Scalia and Ruth Bader Ginsburg, two Supreme Court jurists on opposite sides of the political fence who were fabulous, fabulous friends. This is the model I hope to get students to think about and emulate during all our class discussions about politics and hopefully in life. There are some good articles that can be assigned about the friendship and what made that friendship work. Nino and RBG, as they were known, were warm, professional to each other, and worked together to make the institution of the Supreme Court work. They were friends since the 80s, and both had a love of opera. To quote a Washington Post article, for Ginsburg, their public friendship had made a statement about the court as an institution, that it was strengthened by respectful debate, that it could work no matter how polarized its members were. This is how we should teach students to talk about politics, and I propose we introduce some curriculum on civility. There are some books, Choosing Civility, and I think we should educate the faculty about civility. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Well, when I was asked to speak here, I thought in preparation I would have lunch with a Republican or conservative faculty member and hear his or her perspective. Well, I'm still looking for that Republican. If anyone knows any, please let me know. I hear that there are a few old guys still around, but certainly not anyone who's been hired in the last few years. And I think this has important pedagogical implications. One of the things that has always been, I think, crucial in terms of both parenting and teaching is the idea that do as I do, not do as I say. And we talk, and I think we all agree that the ideal of the university is a place where all points of view are respected, where we're all in a common pursuit of the truth, and regardless of party ideology or perspective, nobody has a monopoly on what is true, and we're all seeking it together. Well, if we won't tolerate any new hires who are from the opposing polity, then what is that we are doing? We're saying that we respect all points of view, but what is it we're doing? And I think that's something we really need to think about. Of course, we don't just need to think about it at AU. AU is kind of an extreme example of what is clearly a national trend. I just did a quick look. It looks like the national ratio of liberal to conservatives on faculty is about 6 to 1. In New England, it's about 30 to 1. In my field of history, the ratio is about 33 to 1. So we're talking about 97% who are liberal in my field, which is a little uncomfortable because I study Russia, and in Russia, the vote levels at the peak of communism for the Communist Party were about the same level. So, in any event, I think we have an issue here, and not only is the political balance amongst faculty at this level, but there's been a major shift too, and especially in the last 10 years, from a plurality of people who describe themselves as moderate liberals to a majority of left-leaning liberals. So I don't have any really firm data about AU, but it seems that we're kind of one of the more politically homogenous campuses in the country. We're probably closer to Liberty University in that sense than we are to our competitors, Boston University or GW. So I guess I'm here to represent the conservative point of view, but I'm no conservative myself. I'm a lifelong partisan Democrat. I worked for David Obey as my first job, who had the second most liberal voting record in the House. I worked on Hillary Clinton's campaign and brought a bunch of my students in along with me as volunteers to work on it. I'm open in class about my perspective. I also try not to bring it up unless there's a reason to bring it up, and I try to maintain a neutral space, but I don't think there's any reason to try to be apolitical, but I do think that we need to recognize every day that we are in a kind of an extraordinarily politically homogenous space. This room, I bet we're all liberals here. I thought maybe we should have an extra chair, like an Elijah's chair at the table for the conservative point of view, but you know, it really is not represented. And our discussions about diverse perspectives are really within not even 50% of the political spectrum, but really more like 25%. So I think this is damaging in a couple ways. One, it contributes to rather than pushes back against the echo chamber effect that's undermining our society. It's dangerous. 58% of Republicans and more broadly young people, not just Republicans, and especially men, have said recently in polls that college does more harm than good and is certainly not worth the cost. The danger is what if conservatives start to opt out of the most liberal colleges? What if they see political homogeneity as a negative when they're looking at colleges that they want to send to? We're a business, and if we write off 50% of the families in the country, this is an issue. I think it's a big gamble. This is a recent gamble that we and many other universities have taken in going for the one-party polity on campus. And it's a small market out there of liberal people who can afford to send their kids to private universities with our kind of bills. I think it also makes us less effective in our social mission. We all are politically active. We believe in social justice, and I think it really hit home for me during the tax bill this fall when the proposal was on the table to tax graduate tuition awards. We should have gathered our respected conservative faculty to mobilize, leaned on their contacts in the GOP, the Wall Street Journal, Fox, White House, but we didn't have anyone to do that. Right now, we should have people from the econ department using their context in the conservative world of ideas to say how ridiculous tariffs on aluminum are, in the name of expertise. And the fear going forward is that expertise itself will become politicized, and we're seeing signs that that's already happening. So this is a dangerous and I think a big gamble that we're taking. I think it's also bad for us ourselves. I know when I was at Harvard as a grad student and a faculty member there, I interacted with conservatives all the time, and I exercised that part of my brain, like arguing back and finding facts to fight against this really sharp guy I had to argue with. That side of the brain is really atrophied. I've sort of lost that ability since coming here. Political discussions in DC, I find, are more about complaining and nodding than actually arguing points of view. So what can we do? Well, we could try to hire a more conservative faculty, but I don't think that's going to happen. I mean, if we haven't hired any in the last 10, 20 years, it's probably, I'd be willing to bet we're not going to hire any more. So the best we can do is acknowledge where we are. I think we have a special responsibility to treat conservative ideas seriously and to include them in our classes. We, along with checking our syllabi to make sure that we have diverse perspectives in terms of gender and race, which we absolutely should do, we should also do an ideology check in our syllabi as well and make sure that we have serious conservative perspectives. We should play devil's advocate. None of us really agree with conservative ideas, but we could pretend like we do and play devil's advocate in our classes. And I try to do that. Maybe it's a little easier when you study Russia and the Soviet Union than it is for other classes, but this is something we could do. And I will note too that trends are that we are bringing in more rural Pell-eligible first-generation students, and we're going to have more students who come from conservative, culturally conservative, and politically conservative backgrounds. And we need to serve them well and respect their points of view if they are indeed conservative, and treat them with respect so that when they leave AU, they can say that their views were taken seriously and respected. And that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Click the top.
How many PhDs does it take to turn on my camera? I guess before we start, I just had one comment. Eric's comments made me think about another Supreme Court justice, Justice Powell, when he was deciding Bowers versus Hardwick, and he asked his clerk, I don't know any gay people. And his clerk said, you do, you just don't know it. So some of it is like, because people walk around, I mean, we have different perspectives. And so actually, I do know several conservatives and Republicans on the campus. But I guess a discussion about that maybe with our colleagues in the audience. But before we get started, I just want to give a caveat and full disclosure is that I don't think I do a great job of this, okay? So why I'm up here, I'm a free lunch. But yeah, I'm a work in progress, and I'm willing to admit that. And I think that's, kind of like why we're all here. And I also don't tend to really veer into a lot of political discussions. I do a lot of policy, and of course, policies do have political motivations behind them. But I don't do a lot of like Republican, Democrat, these kinds of things. But I teach criminal justice, I teach criminology, I teach victimology, I teach juvenile delinquency and issues in urban crime. So we certainly get into a lot of heated discussions and a lot of issues that can be kind of sensitive. So I think this kind of works with our discussion here. And so how I was organizing my thinking and trying to find out, how I can impart knowledge is I started seeing the issue of a few different ways. One is that do we focus on students in the class dynamic? And what happens when you get that, sorry, videotape, oh shit moment, right, in class, and you're like, oh no. So that's one way of looking at it. Another way of looking at it is like, what do we do from the professor preparation perspective? And then another way of looking at it, and the way I'm going to focus on is both, which is I think they're intertwined and interdynamic, and how can we kind of look at both of these types of issues. And so just a few comments about, to start with regard to the kind of professor prep issue, because I think it's one we have a little bit more control over. And ideally, if you can prep some of this stuff, hopefully, also full disclosure, I was a Girl Scout, so always be prepared. So I try to prepare as much as I can. And I'm also a pessimist, so the glass is half empty. So I'm always kind of constantly, it's going to go wrong, and I got to prepare for it. So that's my life, which is why I've been seeing a therapist for 6 years. Okay, so one way of prepping is obviously and this is on videotape. How do you go? one way of prepping is obviously your syllabus. I mean, that frames your class, that frames how we think about things, that frames how you're going to introduce your students to the dynamic of your class, and to kind of create a class climate, ideally, or at least set that out. And one of the things I've started doing in my syllabus, especially because I deal with sensitive issues where students might have disclosure issues, when we're talking about victimology and some of those things. So I've started talking, and people might disclose things in class, and what I wanted to do is to encourage, and actually this is the language I have in my syllabus, which is no matter what the course, you should be interested in being part of a respectful and tolerant classroom. And these principles are particularly relevant in the class I'm talking about. And I said, be aware not everyone has had the same experiences. We all should work to be sensitive of those differences, whether explicitly stated or not. And then I said, that being said, we're not perfect. Do not immediately assume that a misstep on a colleague's part is intended to offend. Another aspect of being respectful is to avoid, this is another thing, but the idea is like, don't impute ill will on people, because sometimes, and I think about this with our students, is that a lot of times what they're doing is it's almost like learning another language. And if I'm learning another language, it's like I wouldn't expect that. I'm not going to say the correct word all the time. I'm going to try, and that's my effort. And I'm not trying to offend somebody because I put a couple words together and I didn't mean that what it sounded like. And so if we can kind of take that from our students, and also have students when they're discussing things kind of remember that aspect, that if we're trying to do this, ideally we'll take in that initial spirit. And so that's what I try to do, that there's, acknowledging being awkward versus trying to impugn ill will to the discussion and what the students are trying to do. And the other thing I do, so that's part of creating the classroom climate. And then the other thing I do is I try to involve readings. Wendy kind of mentioned this as well, as did Derek. That the idea that, are you incorporating different views, different perspectives, and that sort of thing. And as I said, I tend to focus on policy issues. So I try to, what's the evidence? Say, what is it, so policies can come from different motivations, but at the end of the day, we should have some evidence to talk about. And so that way we can either, if the students start bringing other ideas, we can say, okay, well, how would we research that? How would we study that? If that's the back, what ideally would we want to do? What might be some unintended consequences? So to try to frame that as best we can, and also give them the framework to then veer the discussion back to well, what did the readings say? What can we draw from the readings to support your different perspectives here? And then also another comment that's already been made is framing the class with regard to assignments. Maybe working in pairs where people then you switch your paper and have somebody else read the other perspective. And so sometimes that gives a little bit of distance, but also gives voice to different ideas. Also requiring that papers take another side or point of view, or if you're assigning roles in class, I know faculty who say, I've got a role that's going to be harder for a student who comes from a different bent to maybe argue, and we'll try to do that to really push everyone. Again, not saying one side's right or wrong, but just to walk around in somebody else's shoes for a little while. And then also, kind of talk to your students. Sometimes, when I'm trying to figure out what to do, I find my students are a really good resource of well, what would you like to see in the classroom? Or what would be useful for you? Or what would be helpful to create that dialogue, and really kind of working with them, because this, every kind of few years of students, when we have certain discussions in class, I'm always surprised by different perspectives that they bring with them on different ideas, where I'm like, wow, that's really interesting that 3 years ago the students never would have said that, and 4 years ago we're saying something slightly different there. And also for faculty ourselves, do you model that kind of respect and openness, and kind of also willingness to say, hey, I misstepped there, to bring it back and that sort of thing? Do you model that in your classroom? And also, what's on your bookshelf? Are you looking at different types of readings and perspectives and that sort of thing to bring those ideas into class? And so I'm constantly trying to find things when I'm out in the, at a museum or something like that, say, well, do you have ideas about this? Or talking with the docents, or talking to another person when I'm in a conference, saying, hey, I'm interested in that. Could you give me some resources, or do you have some suggestions there? People are really willing to teach and learn if you come to it with that perspective. And then the other thing is, I'll make a note about despite the best laid plans, right? So we have that moment in the classroom where you're like, no, this is going terribly wrong. And those of us who veer towards the introverted are like, okay, I want to be even more introverted right now and just go away. But you have to man up, woman up, person up, that's right. And so I think there's a different, depends on what the situation is. Are there ways to, I think we were just having this conversation before the panel started, of like, there's this balance that you're trying to strike between, again, you don't want to impugn ill will, but sometimes comments are made that you're like, okay, that comment is, there's just a whole bunch of problems there. And that student might not be trying to raise those particular issues, might not have meant that ill intent, but I know some of my students might hear it that way. And trying to find a way of acknowledging the issues with that comment, and then also finding a way for the students who might be offended, but then also not alienating the student who made the comment, and finding a way, can we bring that conversation in? Is there something that you said that, like, I can pull that, and it's like, okay, okay, we don't go there, but let's talk about this particular issue that that's implicit in what you raised. And also I think the idea too is like, is there a way that maybe that comment could be raised in another class? Is there a way that you can come back to it? There's no one way. I think it's very personality driven. It's very in the moment driven. I don't know if maybe there's some resources here on campus, like some ways that we can support faculty, and I'll leave that to our CTRL folks who are much better appraised of those things than I am. But ways of practicing those skills or giving ideas, and again, it's so individualized. It can, what works for one person might not necessarily work for another person, or one classroom might not work for another. So I think at the end of the day, sometimes you have to just think that, you know what, we're not doing brain surgery here. Nobody is going to, at the end of the day, people might get a worst case. Some people might be very offended, but nobody's going to die, and that it's. And that you can always come back the next class, you can take some time and just say, you know what, I didn't handle that well, or this didn't go quite that well, and kind of revisit and just kind of say, this is how you kind of take the ownership, which I think it then is also modeling to your students that, like, nobody's perfect. How do you, like, say, like, okay, if I went astray, how do I kind of bring it back the next class, and do things like that, so.
Yes, the fourth time. Okay. All right. I don't know if this tilts. There we go. Okay. Hi. For something a little different, I also agree that probably the most important place to start this conversation is with yourself and in the creation of your syllabus. And what kinds of readings are in your syllabus? What kind of knowledge are you indicating is important, is worth knowing? Who are you holding up as role models for your students in terms of what they are actually reading in the classroom? And then from there, I really try to bring to my classroom, I'm an IR theorist, and so my classes are always rooted in IR theory. And I teach a second level class in identity, race, gender, and culture in SIS. And for me, every class is structured around an ethical component. And so the ethics that drives my teaching is derived from an IR scholar, Mike Shapiro, and the idea about being willing to be afflicted by the performance of the other. And to think about what it means when we teach, and this ethic that I think is a very productive postmodern ethic. And how is it that we come to empathize, that we come to have a sense of humility in both our teaching and in our interactions with our students, and that we talk to them honestly about relations of power and about how knowledge gets structured, how knowledge gets validated, and that we're willing to open those really difficult conversations. And Spivak, who's noted for writing almost just difficult work to read, at the end of the day says, we're all left struggling with the hard political work of interpretation. There is nothing that is completely ever accessible to us. It all has to be interpreted. It has to be interpreted through our experience. It has to be interpreted through culture, through gender, through class, through all of the varying slices of one's identity, through race, through ethnicity. All of that is embedded in our efforts to interpret what we are given to read, what policies we might be looking at, what events we might be trying to interpret in my field, in international relations. So for me, that's the ethic that drives the class. And I take great pains to explain to the students what that means, the willingness to be afflicted. All of us, we presume somehow that everything is rational and that we approach classrooms with this attachment to Western rationality. And that can't be more further from the truth. Because underneath and shadowing and right alongside rationality is the big E, emotion. And that is constantly operative. So when you are talking about policies and you are talking about immigration or you are talking about unequal pay, whatever kind of current issue you look at, there's always an emotional component. And you've got to let students understand, well, wait a minute, why is this bothering me? Why am I reacting in this way? What are my fears? What might be real perceptible threats to my own sense of identity of who and what I am and how I see myself and how others see me? And how does this relate to these issues we are struggling with in the classroom? So for me, it's about putting together a carefully calibrated series of readings that not only bring up diverse perspectives, but the writers themselves, you can see struggling with policies, with institutions, with inequities. And you can get the students to engage not only on a rational basis, but the emotive content in the way the writers are writing and why they are writing. It's not just what they're reading as students. What do you hear in the voices of those you are reading? What do you hear in their experiences? And so to create a space where there is an opportunity for an honest conversation. I also believe in social construction. So none of this stuff for me is natural. And to talk to students about how we construct what we refer to as the common ground or the common good. And what we're after at the end of the day is so that all of us can flourish. And what does it mean for all of us to flourish? And how do we create a space so that students understand common ground has to be constructed. We have to make it. It doesn't automatically evolve. And if it is imposed by the powerful, and if it is imposed on us, that is not a common good. And so the idea is really, we're turning our world over to them at some point. They're the leaders of the future, so we've got to find a way to give them these kinds of emotional tools to be able to adjust and to be able to have some of these conversations in the classroom. So for me, it's really about helping them identify what the concerns are, what are they worried about, what are the pressing issues, what and how do those pressing issues relate to their own sense of identity, to fears that they might have, and to really be able to create that kind of a classroom dynamic. And at the end of the day as well, we all tell narratives. We're all telling stories about our relationship to events, to policies, to institutions, and we want to see ourselves in those stories, and we want to be a part of those stories. And so I think it is in the classroom that you start to create that space where students see themselves as contributing to these narratives and to the stories that we are creating together about the world we would like to envision, the world we would like to make or see happen. And I think it is also really important to think about these types of concerns because it doesn't just influence how you might lead a discussion in the classroom. I think even more importantly, it influences how you grade their work and how you evaluate them. And if it is uppermost in your mind these types of concerns. And so you get the paper that I've had 4 of them this past week, absolutely had no content. Great ideas and great opinion, but no content. And I use a mix of things. It's not just all Spivak and wacko IR theory. There are videos and there are Colbert Report comedy thing. There's a mix of things to get them engaged. And so I had these students, and one by one I have them into my office, and I just opened the conversation. So what were you thinking when you were writing your paper? And I've already given them all these comments back, kind of responses to their writing, and asking, did you think about this? You could have brought in this example. And to really create a space for them to tell me what happened or what were they thinking as they were writing the essay. And I said to them, in all honesty, I didn't want to jump to the go-to position. I guess you didn't do the reading. So help me understand what you struggled with. Help me understand your challenges. And so that, for me, is a very productive conversation, because many of the students that are sitting opposite me are minority students. And so you're dealing with a lot. And how do you help them discover a sense of confidence in their own ideas, a sense of confidence that they can write in this new way, in academic writing, to write an argument and defend it? So for me, even in those conversations with students, and then I give them the opportunity, you know what, let's try this again. How about if I give you an opportunity, would you like the opportunity to rewrite the essay? Yes, I would. Great. Let's go with that. And so that type, for me, that type of empathy and humility feeds off of itself. And it makes the classroom a safe space, a productive space, so that when we get into some really difficult things, and I give them some really awful things, a Dave Chappelle comedy routine on Native Americans that is absolutely abhorrent, but it does the job it needs to do. And they're able to watch that and deconstruct it and understand it and figure out where all of those stereotypes are coming from. And it creates a really interesting intersection in the classroom for a discourse that is then rooted in academic literatures, so that that can be a productive conversation. But if I can leave you with anything, it would be to recognize the emotional content, to recognize the way to create empathy, humility, to yourself practice and develop self-reflexivity, but also in your students, and to let them know we are co-creators together in what is a common narrative forward, a common ground forward. And so I will leave you with that. Thank you.
So thank you very much to each of our panelists. We're going to open it up for discussion now, and we have a couple of us in the room with mics. Thoughts, comments, questions? Anthony?
Sure. Hi, I'm Mark Schaefer. I'm the university chaplain and also an adjunct instructor in College of Arts and Sciences. A couple of times we talked about civility and talked about empathy, and one of the things that strikes me is that we talk a lot about educating people in civility, and I wonder if we might have the equation wrong, if we're looking at civility as a tool to build community rather than a sense of community out of which civility flows. I mean, the word itself comes from the civitas, from the community itself. So I was wondering if you could speak to the need to, in your eyes, whether that's accurate, whether we need to create some broader sense of campus community in order to foster the civility that will make the kinds of conversations you're talking about possible. Thanks.
Go ahead. Yeah. So one thing that Lynn said really struck me, that you should ask what's on your bookshelf and know thine enemy, or a better way to frame it in terms of your question is to understand your enemy and empathize with your enemy, and then don't give way and fight back. But it's kind of the rule that one of my professors once told me, that the best way to win an argument is to express your opponent's point of view better than he can, and then take it apart so comprehensively that everyone in the room can understand why your point of view is better. That doesn't mean destroying, as is the way on Facebook and on The Daily Show and in so many other venues in our world today, but it's a different thing, and it's a form of discourse I think that universities should strive for, is fully comprehending and understanding opposing points of view and then refuting them. And that builds a sense of civility in a different sense, I think, than just community building in a broad sense.
Excuse me, Tony Quainton at School of International Service, a lapsed historian. So to get back to the current problem of political polarization as it's reflected on the campus, I think there are a couple of techniques that are helpful. And one is, in fact, history. That is, so much of what we teach is in a context of what has happened in the past and what has changed in our specific skill set. And I think it's often particularly when these have political implications or reflect policies which were adopted in the past by former presidents, former governments, whatever it may be, that it helps students to get a perspective that almost any administration, Democratic or Republican, makes mistakes, and to understand that the possibility of mistakes goes with your ideological predisposition here. And I was unlucky enough, I don't know, to work for both Republican and Democratic administrations, and students often ask, well, how did you do that? You know, weren't you compromised at some point on one side or the other? And to get students to think of what they are learning and what they're learning how to do is to be constructive, engaged citizens who will put their talents at the service of the society largely understood, and not just at the service of a particular political party, however important that may be. And it is important, obviously, that that our students stay engaged in the political process. I, on a number of occasions, have had students write speeches for President Trump. And at first there's pushback. They say, I don't want to do it. I can't do that. And I say, well, sure you can. Think about what the rhetoric is and the arguments that are put forward for it, and see if you can't get your mind at least to understand how another point of view is being put forward. And they do that quite well, funnily enough, and without a lot of say, well, I can't, at first they say, gee, do I have to? And then, but then when they do it, they're not unhappy that they have done it and feel satisfied that they have come to understand a point of view which in normal common discourse they would have panned or ridiculed. And I think the danger that we fall into is, all of us, I think, in the current climate, is that we engage in ridicule and not discussion and not analysis. And it's so easy. I served in a number of foreign countries where it was plenty easy to ridicule the leaders of those countries, and one had to be very careful that ridicule almost never serves public policy well, I think. One other thing I think that we could all do, and this is the question, do we know any Republicans? Or are there any around? I found, as appropriate, bringing Republicans, this case people from the George W. Bush administration, into the classroom, quite helpful. People they never thought they would ever see or meet, who turn out not actually to be sort of fire-eating dragons of a dreadful, that you can show by bringing into the classroom people of divergent political perspectives, both Republican and Democrat, that there is a kind of core of rationality in the way in which our political life goes forward, and not be distracted, I think, by the tweeting environment in which we find ourselves now, because I think it is important that students get beyond the ridicule into thinking about the substance of the arguments that are being put forward, whether we agree with them or disagree with them. And as many of you have said, there's a heavy disagreement quotient in our intellectual life on this campus, but it doesn't excuse us from the need to get our students to think critically, thoughtfully about alternate points of view. And there are exercises that can be built into the classroom to do that, it seems to me. There are people you can bring into the classroom that help. that you don't rely on your own skills and expertise or prejudices or knowledge. And I guess I'd urge us all to think about how we can do those things. Doesn't solve the problem completely, because there is so much emotion now built into our political discourse. But I think one can get, my experience in the last 18 months is that it is in fact possible to get past it without getting students throwing things at each other because they violently disagree about the substance of what's going on.
I'm a Republican and happy to be here. And while I was thinking of, in terms of Ms. Addington's comment about there are a lot more of us around than you might realize, I doubt that. I think I could certainly, sense the odds of the 30 to 1 Democrats to Republicans and so on. It's probably so. But actually, I don't know. It doesn't come up very often in my one class that I teach at the law school. It's just not particularly relevant. And I try and actually be inconsistent in class discussions. Excuse me. Sometimes I'm for something that's more of a conservative position. Sometimes I speak in favor of a more liberal position. And if students can't figure me out or think I'm inconsistent, that's fine too. Because that's, again, challenge me or agree with me, whatever. So we're around.
Let's have lunch.
Hi, I'm Sherry Williams in the School of Communication. I don't know what is going on over here. Oh, okay. Dr. Shinko, I think you made a really good point about how knowledge is produced. I'm sorry. Okay. How knowledge is produced and even whose knowledge is prioritized and seen as important. So one question that I have, because I do certainly think that as professors we definitely need to be including and respective of everyone's political, ideological point of view, and even faith traditions, everything. But one thing that I worry about sometimes in class, and something that I see, is that people with dominant ideologies and dominant identities sometimes seem to be co-opting the language of the oppressed when they're saying, like, you're not really respecting me, but their ideas, their ways of knowing have always been prioritized and they've always been taught. And when people don't agree with them, then they start to co-opt the positions and the knowledge of the dialogue of people who really haven't had their opinions be woven into the mainstream. So how do we kind of balance all of this? Because it needs to be done, but it's getting really, really tricky.
Yeah, no, that is a really excellent point, and thank you for bringing that up. And I think, again, what I try to do in the classroom is to kind of keep it focused on what is the thing that we are discussing. Is it a policy? Is it a structure of power? And to get students to focus on what might look, what are in fact, what might we be able to agree are inequities in this particular situation or in this policy. And also thinking, for me too, it's also the discourse and the language that's being used. And so I try to keep it focused on the entity that we are discussing, whatever that might be. And so that the student doesn't take that defensive position and use precisely that kind of a justification is really, I think, more for me about keeping it focused on the policy and getting the students that might speak from that dominant perspective to really take a look at what the alignment of facts are in terms of the policy that we're looking at. For instance, if you're looking at inequalities in home ownership across ethnic and racial groups. And so when you show the students kind of the numerical statistics that stand behind who gets access to home ownership, how that impacts a family's wealth, a family's ability to move forward, you can shift it off of that really highly personalized kind of perspective of the dominant, that you're not letting me speak and say my perspective, and say, okay, well, what really are you trying to defend here? What are you worried about? What are you afraid about here? What do you see that might be disconcerting in this issue that we're discussing? And so for me, I always try to pull it back to a middle space that I can open, hopefully in the discussion in the classroom. So I hope that is somewhat of an answer for you.
John Yonner, Communications. I'm teaching public speaking. I don't need a mic. I'm allowed now. So, and my thing about technology, I don't rely on it. This is a small room. Anyone should be able to speak up. But so my point is, why wouldn't you identify your politics? I come from the Hill. It started with Stu McKinney, a liberal Republican. Worked both sides of the aisle. I'm a registered Democrat now. I think it's interesting you said you're a Republican but didn't state your name. I can do that. And Lynn, apparently it's easier for you to admit to therapy maybe than politics. The other thing I'd be afraid of, in my class I haven't outed them yet, but there's one kid who knows how to shoot a rifle. He grew up in the South, and in this atmosphere, I'm not sure he'd ever want to admit that. I know I have one Republican. This is all anonymous. So, and I told him on both sides of the aisle. I've worked in both Republican and Democratic administrations, full time, to get that out, because a lot of people told me that. And lastly, I have a Sherry story. I met her last week, and I appreciate all this help. I mean, as a newbie, it's incredible. So Sherry tells me the story, and it's very correct in what you don't know, and be careful what you do. So in my class, the students are giving their team presentations, and so I was very concerned about gender and being right about this. So they wanted their team name to be the Bad Boys. I said, well, how can you be the Bad Boys when there's 2 females and 1 male on your team? And I'll never forget this woman. Young lady puts her hands on her hips and she says, well, how do you know what gender I identify with? And I thought, oh my God, I stepped on a landmine. And then everybody in the class cracked up because it was very funny. So my only point is sometimes this gets so charged, but the students can be funny about some of this stuff in a way that newbie kids going around. But that was after you told me that, but she was hilarious. So anyway, but why wouldn't we tell this? I told her this.
Okay. I'll say, because since you outed me, and I think we should, and I think we should talk about a lot of things like these, because whether it's therapy or whatever type of thing. And I am both a recovering lawyer and a PhD, so it's Dr. Addington. Sorry, that's my little thing. But I would say, because you assume the way that I identify, right? I mean, we've got identity. You mentioned gender and that sort of thing. You assume that, like, I identify with a particular political party. I'm part of that generation that, like, we grew up in the shadows of Watergate and everything like that. So, like, there's no good guys, gals, people. And so there's an assumption that, like, I identify in some way. And, quite frankly, I'll say that I live in D.C. I am a registered Democrat, but that's the only way you can vote and have a voice in D.C., right? So the idea of, like, identifying with political affiliation to me is like, okay, that's like saying, like, well, what religion or gender or that sort of thing. There's an assumption that there is an identity there, as opposed to it's not usually relevant in my class. I mean, if it's it's not relevant. If it's relevant to what I'm talking about, but to just go in there and go, hi, by the way, I'm all these identities that have nothing to do with what I teach in my class. And then also, I don't want to alienate students that would be like, well, you're coming out with these, this is how you're presenting yourself. And now I'm kind of like, well, okay, what are you coming with an agenda, or why are you telling me this stuff? So if it doesn't fit with what I'm talking about. I mean, sometimes I'll say, like, I come from the Midwest because it's relevant to, like, a particular thing. But otherwise, why does it matter whether I come from the Midwest or New York or, Oregon or live in D.C. all my life?
Well, I can answer that. I think it's quite different. As Eric said, there's an assumption here on these campuses, and unless you're at Liberty or Hillsdale, whatever it is in Pennsylvania, the 2 things I wouldn't want to be on campus would, among other things, but typically here is a Republican or an NRA member. I would never admit that. I think it'd be difficult particularly for a student. That's why I did it, and the reason I did it is to say, whatever your opinions are, you can
I just want to add that I think that the way to get at this is through the content of what you're teaching. And I think that that's where it becomes an area that you can explore, because then you can present examples of good strategic communication messaging, bad strategic communication messaging, both sides of the aisle. And then you get at this through the content, which I think helps to inoculate against the concern fairly raised that you are coming out making these proclamations about your, identity in some way, and students could perceive that you've got a hidden agenda here. Why are you doing this if this is not relevant to the conversation or material that we are addressing at hand? When it becomes relevant, I think it's entirely appropriate to say this. I mean, I'm in trouble. I'll share a personal example. I'm a lifelong Democrat. My husband's a Republican, totally disgusted and wants to leave the party. And I'm fighting. Please don't do that. For the sake of our children, for the sake of balance, for the sake of... So here I am. I'm not going to be able to use that anymore if he changes. So I'm fighting it.
One other comment I'll just make too. I think it's really important to have a conversation with your students about categories of difference and actually how we structure categories. And there's nothing wrong with making delineation and identifying differences. And the problem is when they become differences in valuation, and then they're hierarchicized and they're associated with morality and immorality and kind of all of those sets of binaries that go with them. But I think they really enjoy that kind of a conversation about categorization, and some differences are fine. You want to differentiate between French and California wines. That's great. And there are some differentiations that make a lot of sense, and then to really interrogate the categories of difference that might not make a lot of sense, and how we might begin to restructure or deconstruct those categories, I think is always an interesting conversation as well. So, 2 cents from the postmodernist.
Hi, my name is Tarek Masarani with SIS. 2 questions. One is, you mentioned the ratios of conservative and liberal faculty. I'm curious if there's any data around what the applicant pool looks like in terms of those ratios. Is there a self-selection process going on here, and how many humanities and social science professors have a conservative ideology? And the other question is, you said something like hiring is not realistic because it's not been done in the last 10 or 20 years, but to the extent that this has been presented as a kind of an escalating issue, something that's more pressing than it may have been in the time, then why isn't that something that can change, just as hopefully we're making progress in diversity inclusion around other issues as well, even if it hasn't been done in the last decades or ever?
Yeah, I'm no expert on this. I just did a little bit of homework for this, specifically for this talk, and I just read a few articles. But it's true that there's a kind of a vicious circle going on where conservatives are not choosing humanities, in part because they don't feel like they're welcome there and it's not their world. But even if you deflate for that, there's a much larger percent of conservative applicants than there are people being hired. That's pretty clear. And I think it expresses itself not in terms of a political litmus test per se. It's, in my field anyway, it's more people who do certain types of old, not cutting edge history are kind of excluded from the job description. Things like straight political history, diplomatic history, military history, economic history, business history. I mean, the list is pretty long, actually, of things that used to be standard in history departments that now have been eliminated in favor of types of history that draw more liberal applicants. So that's one sort of thought on that. Going forward, in terms of, I mean, one could, I suppose, put on job ads a statement that diverse candidates with diverse ideological perspectives are invited to apply, something like that. Or we could just be honest and say conservative political applicants will not be considered, something like that. But I mean, there are ways to address this.
I guess one of the things that concerns me the most, I'm Carla, I'm from the AU Museum, is the idea that expertise is becoming politicized. So to be an expert and to depend on actual facts and not alternative facts is becoming something that is associated with the left and the Democrats. And that's very disturbing because we're talking about opinions, that everyone's entitled to his or her opinion. Everyone's entitled to his or her informed opinion, and I believe that's what the college education should be. So I'm wondering how you can correct that, if there's a way to correct it.
I'll take a stab because I think what you're talking about is a very effective strategic communication campaign that has been launched regarding fake news, alternative facts. All of these are slogans. This is strategic messaging at its very best, quite frankly. And I pointed out. But there are also serious consequences. And so if you are trying to launch a campaign using communication to demonize institutions, to demonize the media, to demonize the political polling process in this country, this has been and is a very effective strategy. And I think we have to teach our students in terms of recognizing this, being literate, understanding how a strategic communication campaign is put together, recognizing how effective it is, understanding the consequences, and then looking at, okay, is there strategic messaging coming back to counter this? Where is that coming from? Is it happening? Same thing with Obamacare. All of this is in this kind of vein. And I think understanding that, understanding how we put together our messaging, how it can be used to concentrate power in the executive branch, how propaganda can be used. These are the kinds of things that understanding communication is how I would approach it, but that's my area of expertise and my background. I welcome other thoughts.
I have one quick thought. There was an article I read a little while ago by, I think it was in the Washington Post. It was interviews with leading, or Atlantic Monthly, it was interviews with leading editors of conservative, respected intellectual magazines. And there's a real sense of crisis that the conservative Republican intelligentsia is in a real crisis right now. And I agree, you should convince your husband to stay in the party because the dissociation of university life from conservative intellectual life is, I think, a really bad thing for our civic for our polity and our civil society, and something that we should all really kind of think about. I mean, I think there should be a home for serious conservative ideas in every institution of higher education. It's important for our country going forward and for real serious debate. And just to go back to also this point that Lynn made about what's on your bookshelf, I think it's important for all of us to read some of the best conservative journals and some of the best conservative books out there, and to take that side of it seriously and not get all of our view of what conservatism is today from Facebook blasts and Twitter blasts and Daily Show sort of send-ups.
And I would welcome CTRL helping us with that and putting together a kind of list that people can contribute to that we may use as a resource. Just a thought.
Hi, my name is Barbara Ween, and I teach alternatives to war and violence in the School for International Service. And in fact, the Washington Post did a wonderful magazine issue on the small, old school conservative magazines that are still available to us. There are 7 of them, and they're very well respected. And they talked all about the intellectual crisis that they're having. I don't know how many of folks here saw that special issue of the Washington Post magazine about conservative. Yeah, it was very well done, don't you think? They interviewed all the editors. I always adopt the perspective of what it feels like to be a minority voice in a group. The whole perspective of peace and nonviolence is often very marginalized, very besieged and dismissed. So all my life working to end war and working with nonviolent movements, I know what it feels like to kind of be silenced and marginalized in a very hawkish profession of international relations. So I always adopt that perspective. Okay, I know what it's like to be the minority in the room. And so it's really important that we protect minority voices and preserve space for them. The best dialogues I've had in my classroom are with my soldiers who have come back from Iraq and Afghanistan, and we have really rich discussions in class around that about what can make us safe. Does war make us safer? And they offer all kinds of contending points of view. And of course, our authors do that as well. We look through many different lenses on global security. And I have a deep and begrudging respect for the realist school. I mean, I wish we could get back to the realist school. And I think that's what I was looking for a little bit in this conversation, is that the nature of the word conservative has changed fundamentally. The whole political spectrum has shifted. And I start off with this in other countries. Where have we seen the nature of fake news in the rise of authoritarian governments around the world? I don't deal with it here. I look at it in Poland, Hungary, Russia, Egypt, all these other countries that are seeing the rise of authoritarianism and the manipulation of news and elections, and let them reflect on whether there's connections here as well. I never talk about partisan politics here in the classroom. Let them draw their own conclusions as well. But I think part of what you're grappling with, what you raised, is that the whole framework of understanding around what it means to be a conservative has changed. So that we're trying to, puzzle this out. It's so, because the real word conservative is to conserve and preserve. I mean, I'm a conservative when it comes to the environment. I'm a conservationist, right? So what is the real meaning of conservative? And that we could have really great philosophical discussions about, as Rose does, through so many lenses. Oh, and one final thing, I'm sorry. Just that our Center for Diversity and Inclusion has a great framework for us to use, which is the difference between debate, discussion, and dialogue. And we can model that in our classroom, and you compare and contrast it at the start of the semester with your students. This is what a real dialogue looks like. You're not hardening your positions and digging in. You're really seeking to understand each other.
Oh, sure. Hi, Josh Joseph with, oh, sorry, why don't you go ahead?
Hi, I'm Megan Lickey. I'm the Director of Sustainability. And to go back to the idea of facts, it's something that I struggle with a lot when I teach about climate change. And I have always approached teaching climate change from the perspective of how did we get to this knowledge? So how did the IPCC come to their conclusions? Who are the members of the IPCC? Where did they get there? How did they have their discussions? And take it back to that level. But what I struggle with is going back even farther, like, what is the scientific method? How do we come to these conclusions? Where is scientific debate, and how does that differ from political debate? And I think that that's something that is really hard to give students space around to come to understand, because it's almost seen as a character flaw to change your mind halfway through the discussion on, I came in here not believing in climate change, not understanding the science, not having these opinions that may have come from their source of news or may have come from who they talk to. And if in that room they're given new sets of knowledge, how do we give them the space to change their mind or to begin to see where the other people are coming from, or to respect that scientific debate is very different from political debate? And I'm wondering how other people have dealt with that when we were talking about science and not necessarily politics, but now what has become the intersection of those two things.
I think that's a great question, and one that in not the hard science perspective, and also wow, and the whole talking about science politics like colliding right now. And as somebody who's faced a similar issue in a government report I was writing that went from one administration to the other, and certain language became accepted or not. I can, on a small level, appreciate what you're going through. But I think that is hard because, and I love that way that you phrased it with the space to change their mind once they get more knowledge. Because part of it is that if they knew everything coming in here, why are you here? You know, right? It's like, we should just, instead of applying, we give you your bachelor's degree and off you go. But the idea is that hopefully we are imparting knowledge and it's not just verifying their opinion. And so I think that's interesting. I don't know whether that's something you could build into the syllabus or start with where were you initially and for everyone, and then like at the beginning of like a week or a section where you're talking about a particular issue, and then later on, hey, did you change, or like what made you really kind of go, that's, or pause a moment or something like that. But rather than kind of force them to say, gosh, now I'm a completely different person, but just like that made me pause and then maybe mull it over a little bit or something like that. I've done some similar things in topics where it's like later on the students they'll do a reaction paper and go like, hey, I didn't think about that before, and now I'm kind of thinking about it a little bit. And certainly the idea, the debate around the sciences and any kind of knowledge, because we do a lot of evidence-based policy discussions in my class, but even when you look at what the evidence is, because there's like, well, what's, because obviously we want the randomized trials and that sort of thing. Sometimes that's just not ethically possible when you're talking about social policy and that sort of thing. But what are the limitations with some of this, so that even people in this area can debate like, well, was the right method or that sort of thing. But I think that playing with that idea that you provided of like giving them space, and I think that building around that, I think that's really cool. I really like that idea, and maybe finding a way to build our syllabi out to include some of that, because I think sometimes we feel so pressured to like, we've got 500 topics to talk about before spring break, and that's next week, and they're feeling pressured because we're all doing it, and they've got 5 or 6, however many classes because they're overloaded, and then they're interning and the whole other thing. But to the extent that we build that into the syllabus, I think that's a really great idea, and I really appreciate you bringing up that topic and that perspective. Thank you.
So Josh Joseph, SIS. Thank you, first of all, for the conversation. A lot of the examples that you've been talking about are things that teachers can do ahead of time, put it into the syllabus, kind of think about your perspective. Lynn, you had an example, though, and you said, I liked it, things sometimes are awkward, right? They don't always go the way...
That was the PG version.
So I wonder if you or others could talk about, I'm particularly interested in when something happens in the classroom or elsewhere, right? Because wherever we are, we have conversations that don't go exactly the way we'd like them to do. I'd just love to hear some examples of how you learn, improvise, just some things that would be related to that, things that we might benefit from.
So I'll give that a try now. I'd like to hear other people's thoughts. But, okay, why don't we do that? Do you want to do others? Others in the audience got ideas? Good. Thank you. Even better.
I admit this is not my technique. I stole it from Fanta, but I learned it from one of the workshops I went to. I teach stereotyping and prejudice, and sometimes you have those crap moments and things get tense. I think it also goes to speaking to giving people space to reflect. And I have established in this class at least having journals that I tell them, I really don't look at them, but I tell them that, I just want to make sure you're not, putting your shopping list in here. I want to know that you're actually reflecting on the issues that we're talking about in this class. And so I try and reserve the last 5 minutes of class for them to do that. But I haven't had to use it yet, but my phantom moment is I always have that in the back of my mind that if everything goes to hell in a handbasket, I'm going to say, okay, we're just going to take a break. Everybody take out their journals. Let's all just talk about how we're feeling, what we're thinking, and we're going to come back to it later. And great discussion. On a side note, let me just add that in my field, psychology, they did a survey, and there were 3 people at a conference of 1,000 that admitted to being Republican. Then they did an anonymous survey to the entire Society of Experimental Social Psychologists, and more did admit in that survey, but many, many people admitted that they would not hire somebody who applied to their department if they knew they were Republican. So indicative to your question of how do we change it, if we don't believe that's even valuable, and will actively not hire someone of that perspective, it's not going to change.
Hi, everyone. I'm here with my colleague. We represent the staff side of things. We're with SOC. I'm in graduate academic services, and Justin is in undergraduate academic services. So, from a staff perspective, those who support our students and our faculty, how would you? I guess my question is, what would be your advice to us as students come and speak to us with various questions and issues? Should we raise those concerns with you? Would you be open to hearing some of the things that students are raising? They may not be comfortable raising it with you, right, in the classroom. How would you go about that? Do you want to add anything, Justin? No? Okay.
Wondering if it would be helpful for the audience. I don't mean to put you on the spot, but can you give a concrete example of some of what you're hearing from a student perspective?
I don't have a concrete example, but I'm just thinking ahead. If we do have such instances, especially since this is a hot topic these days, right? So
a concrete example I've heard from conservative students fairly regularly is that we have this discourse of having evidence-based arguments, right, in the classroom, but that they often feel like more progressive or liberal-minded students are not challenged to defend their opinions with evidence in the same way that conservative students are asked to.
Okay, I'll take the first stab at this, because I did briefly touch on this concern that I was also hearing from students in my remarks. And so we have obviously student chapters of both the Democratic National Party and the Republican Party on campus, which my understanding is they get along very well together. They have a very good relationship. I think that where I personally, as a professor, would love to hear this feedback if I don't know it directly. One of the things I've learned, especially from our advising office, is that things that work really well is how do we communicate with our students without judging? How do we create a space where there's no judgment? And so learning those techniques, I'm actually learning from our staff in SOC and out of the advising office. So I really find that very helpful. So I think that dialogue needs to happen. As a professor, I want to know that because I'm very, very sensitive to this in the classroom. And I have a member, a student in my classroom who feels very comfortable wearing his RNC jacket, you know, with the logo right on the sleeve in class, and you know, loves to talk about politics and creating a space for that student in the classroom to be able to have that kind of conversation where other students also respect him and willing to let his voice come through. So I don't know if that gets at it a little bit, but that's a start.
I also think here's where it's really important what you're giving them to read in the classroom, and how you structure the dialogue so that if there only is evidence for the progressively minded students to be able to construct an argument, and there isn't evidence for students that might have other perspectives to construct an argument, then you've already pre-configured the classroom dialogue. And so I think part of it is really encouraging students to go into the text, pull out what it is they're identifying as evidence, and being able to discuss it, but that presupposes that it's a level playing field and that you've created evidentiary basis for students to be able to argue on multiple sides of an issue. And that takes a lot of forethought in each class and how you're structuring it. Because then that's pervasive when you give the essays, when you give the exams. That all compounds, and I could easily see how conservative students would feel that they're not being, you know, that they're being held to a harder standard, you know, or a higher standard than are some of the other students. And I, as a professor, would absolutely want to know that. I absolutely would. And I think, you know, it would probably, that would probably really bother me, and I'd want to figure out how I could improve and what I could do better. So I would want to know.
I'm Julie Wickham in SIS. I'm staff. I was struck by a gentleman saying that people affiliated with the NRA were afraid to identify themselves. And that's a real red flag to me. That's a higher bar than even saying I'm a Republican, which to me should be just baseline. Is anybody else interested in our getting to a point where we can actually say this is what I'm affiliated with? I'll be glad to talk with you about it.
I don't know what you're asking.
That you identify yourself as being affiliated with the NRA.
Personally, if I was, I would say so.
Okay.
Not particularly.
Not particularly.
Favor of everything that the NRA does.
No, I get that, yeah.
But I certainly don't hesitate to stand up and say things like that. Indicate. Rick Schneider, by the way. So I don't know. Obviously, I'm not a student here. I'm faculty.
Yeah.
So I'm in a different position, perhaps. Just different stresses, different concerns about speaking out on controversial positions. So I don't know. I'm bold enough or stupid enough to stand up and say things. Not everybody is. So I can react.
Just a comment on the NRA thing. I grew up in northern Wisconsin, and all of us were members of the NRA. I mean, you had to be to go through hunter safety course. The leadership of the NRA has hijacked the organization and uses membership dues that people pay for other reasons. So membership per se is not a litmus test of anything.
I think culturally it is, though.
Depends where you are.
In this
suburban
country.
Bethesda, yes. In most of our country, no.
How about on this campus?
Yeah, I think so.
Hi, Mark Schaefer again. I have another question. As I'm listening to our conversation, I'm wondering if we are neglecting an important consideration in all of this, because we're all addressing this problem as one of ideas. Is that we have to have the balance of ideas in the classroom, and people need to be open to hearing competing ideas. But what if none of this has anything to do with ideas, and it's just simply tribal identities that people latch onto? There was an article, I think it was your comment, that reminded me of something that I read where they pointed out that the reason people don't believe in climate change is because that's what they're supposed to do as either liberals or conservatives. That most liberals, myself included, have never looked at the climate. I'm not a climatologist. I have no idea. I trust the scientists, but I also do it because that's what liberals are supposed to do. And so if the reality is that we're dealing not with anyone actually engaging the ideas, but simply identifying tribally, how do we overcome that in the classroom to get people to a place where actually re-examining your tribal ideologies is permissible on that level to engage in these kinds of conversations? Because I think it's not surprising that a bunch of academics would sit around and look at this academically and sort of imagine that it is actually about what we teach and say and think. But I'm not sure that a lot of our students view it that way. I think a lot of them are simply and I think a lot of the country as a whole is adapting a kind of tribal mindset, Democrat, Republican, liberal, conservative, that puts up a barrier to us actually saying, if you will only listen to my ideas, you might have a different perspective.
I think it's a really great point, and I don't think that we are necessarily in an extraordinary moment for that. I mean, I don't know what the exact percent of people who didn't believe in evolution has been over the last century, or that smoking causes cancer has been over the last century, but I suspect it lines up on partisan lines as well, and it follows that belief sort of trumps the science underlying that. You could probably reason with the people who respond to surveys in that way, and they would admit the science, but then they'd probably still somehow, in the same character, same individuals, still be able to say, well, no, I don't believe in that. So it's something that our role is to try to tip the scales towards the science side of it, but we're never going to totally overcome the tribal aspect or the identity aspect of these issues.
Hi, my name is Barbara Stoll. I'm an adjunct in ALTA, And I've just been here 8 months since I joined here, and I think there are several comments we should really follow up on. I am a Republican, still registered as a Republican in DC, because I'm kind of like your husband. I'm not very happy with what the conservatives or the Republicans are doing. I was a Reagan Republican. I voted for Obama twice. Maybe I'm conflicted and confused, but I think that we're back to Barbara's point. You know, we're not, as a conservative, it's just different. It's not the Reagan conservative that we're under right now. And there were a lot of never this candidate people within the Republican Party who are not very happy but are quiet right now. So it's interesting to me. And Nicholas Kristof did an article in December 2016, and he talked about echo chambers, and he said only 10% on campuses are Republicans, and that 90% are not, whatever the others are. And I think back to your point, Dr. Lohr, that if we're excluding half the families in America, or if we're excluding the flyover states, we're missing a lot. The Wall Street Journal had an article a couple of months ago about rural communities and bringing in rural students, and I think that that is a really important thing that we should be doing within our culture, because my cousins who are farmers in Missouri are scared to send their kids, their grandkids, to college because they're afraid of what they're going to suffer if they go to college. And that's not, we don't want to be Liberty University, but we also don't want to be the extreme like you brought up. The other thing I wanted to say was that last week I had an opportunity to have coffee with the young woman who is the head of the Young Americans for Freedom on this campus. And it was very interesting because the actual organization has changed 3 times in the last year with the direction that they're trying to go. She seemed very moderate to me. We didn't agree on everything, but it was a very interesting conversation and how she feels on this campus. And I think we should all look at what some of these organizations are doing. She actually doesn't support the Young Republicans either. And so it's an interesting piece, but there are not very many of them. So I think if we all open our minds to what they're talking about, there's a lot of listening. And I really liked your point about counterarguments, because we don't want your brain to atrophy when you have to think about the other side.
Hi, my name is Julie Walton, and I am an SIS graduate student and a staff member. And I lean more right, and so I thought I would just maybe offer my perspective as a student on what has been helpful and what has been challenging. If I can be honest, I often, what you articulated earlier, I feel the burden to prove that I have come to my conclusions with academic integrity, not just in like the violating the code part of it, but that I have researched, that I have thought through. Often when I've presented a divergent opinion in class, my classmates and even my professors are quick to point to, well, they roll their eyes, that's just the narrative you've chosen, that blah, blah, blah. And in that moment, you think, are you sure? Or is it possible that I have researched, that I have conducted an academically rigorous assessment of these ideas and have landed at a different conclusion than you have? And I don't always feel that I'm given the benefit of the doubt in that. As somebody who leans more on the right, it's assumed that I inherited my opinions rather than having arrived at them honestly and with integrity. And to your point, Professor, is it Melillo? Am I saying, saying that correctly? I loved what you spoke of, that the divergent opinions, that there was something about the beauty of that in the Supreme Court. And I wonder if we need to reach for that as academia. I came to American knowing that I would be more on the outside, knowing that I would be in classes with people who didn't hold my same opinions, because I saw something of value in the way, if I can for a minute be us and them, in the way you think that's different than how I think. I was hoping that I would be welcomed in that. Do you view me as a missing piece to what you're trying to do? Do you view how I think about things as providing a piece of the puzzle that you may have overlooked or forgotten? Or as a conservative, I don't all the way know what to label myself right now, but as somebody who leans right, am I just in the way? Am I just a narrative that needs to be overcome as what does that make sense? So in the classroom, I feel that pressure to flip, that's really the only sign of having now arrived at academic rigorous training, is that I would come to your conclusions rather than that we still maintain our deep convictions, but we can do that in conjunction. the last thing that I would say is I really appreciated, Rose, what you said. The times that have been the most helpful for me in my classes here at SIS has been when we can have a rigorous and courageous discussion of ideas rather than defaulting to ad hominem attacks, attacking my narrative, my background. And I have been bummed out at the times that that hasn't happened, where I have brought an idea and it's quick to go towards narrative, background, all of that, rather than, that's an interesting idea, let's talk about the idea. And to me, as somebody who leans right, if I believe enough in my idea, then I ought to be able to defend it, I ought to be able to think through it, I ought to be able to be challenged, and I would like that from my classmates as well. So I don't know if that's a helpful perspective. To me, it makes me think of that quote that we often judge others by their behavior, but ourselves by our intentions. And I think as somebody who leans right, I would like to be judged by my intentions. I would like to be treated as someone like I'm sharp, I'm intelligent, I got the same GRE scores as my more left-leaning, I worked my buns off to be here, I'm paying for it, all of that. I'd like to be treated with that same benefit of the doubt. And I think that that is what civility is. I think that is how we're gonna arrive. And if we assume everyone only thinks the one way, then we're missing incredible opportunities for collaboration, would be my 2 cents.
Final thoughts. There's a lot to think about here.
I have one question based on you said chaplain,
Eileen,
try the mic.
right?
Eileen? Oh, sorry, I did not. So my question would be, the tribalism is the e pluribus unum, and sometimes too much unum, not enough pluribus, but at the White House on the gun, since I brought up NRA, there was a man from Columbine who said what they've found is the difficulties going in between those, the unity and the diversity. And if they go to one side too far or the other side too far, they lose people. So just like Julie, I appreciate what you said. That's a big deal. I think anyone who's worked on the Hill, you see there's brilliant people on both sides, and you're in a fight, and you better fight it. So it'd be good to have some help to sway between those two, how you handle it as professors. And Rose, by the way, I can't believe you used David Chappelle. That is so gutsy. But
it's out there.
Yeah, well, try Tambourine by Chris Rock will be your next step, and then you'll be in unemployment line as my guess. But anyway, I don't know how you veer between those two things, because clearly you don't sound included, and that's not right.
And let me, Julie,
Is it Julie or Eileen? I'm sorry. Julie, got it.
And the comment really comes back to how we approach the classroom, and I think the point about creating this safe space where students can engage these issues. We need to admit these problems that we face are way more complicated than any one singular perspective could solve, because if they could, they would have, and we would not be where we are. And I think there's got to be some honesty that when we are in front of a classroom, we're not there solving things. We're not providing the answer. We're providing the space for a rich conversation. I went to law school and hated it. I was in there 2 days and I was like, oh my God, I am so in the wrong space. And I really don't like debate. I like the much more Socratic kind of conversation. I don't even like the hard-edged Socrates where he really goes after people. That bothers me. I really want that space for an engaged, safe way to be able to bring these ideas and pieces of ideas out and look at them, evaluate them, discuss them. And we've got to be honest and courageous enough as professors to say, I don't know. I don't know what the answer is here. But I think it would take a much broader perspective, a much greater culling of pieces of ideas to even be able to think our way forward. And I feel terribly that that has been your experience in the classroom, because that should not be the case. That's not why we're here. And I apologize for that. And being, the dean in the undergrad side, I'm the recipient of a lot of these conversations with students that are in my office, you know, telling me about experiences elsewhere on the undergrad level. And those are always in my mind every time I'm in class. It's like, okay, no, don't say that, don't do that, be careful about that. But I think we need to create that honesty. I don't know the answer.
And I just want to close out by saying, Julie, I hear you. This is more serious, I think, people, than we might understand. A group of students has gone to Professor Burwell about exactly that. Maybe that's why we're here today. I don't know. Mary's no longer in the room, or I would ask her. But this is serious. We can't have students feeling that they are not welcome in their own classrooms. And I think we need to think very long and hard about how we address this.
And that, you know, really what I think is heartrending about it, that feeling of lack, of not being good enough, not being like, and always judging oneself by what one doesn't have. That has a terrible psychological toll on a person and their capacity, especially in an intellectual environment, to really flourish. And I think that is really, I would agree with you, I think it is a very serious problem. And I really applaud your courageousness for speaking so personally.
Okay, well, thank you again to each of our panelists. Thank you all for being here, for taking the time to start this very important and insightful conversation, this noontime conversation. There will be others, so this is just part one. Stay tuned. Our next noontime conversation is March 22nd. Thank you.